The proceeding is currently suspended. The proceeding is currently suspended.
Welcome back to this afternoon's session of the Foreign Affairs Committee. We're now very fortunate to be joined by Ms. Briggs and Mr. Jenkins. Perhaps I could ask you both very briefly just to introduce yourselves. Ms. Briggs, because you're in the room, I'll go with you first, if that's right.
Thank you for having me. Rachel Briggs, the CEO of the Clarity Factory.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jenkins.
Brian Jenkins, Senior Advisor to the President of the RAND Corporation.
Thank you very much indeed, both of you, for joining us. It's extremely good of you to make time. Ms. Briggs, perhaps you could start us off. Could you describe the extent of countries using state hostage-taking as a tool of leverage? We've spoken a little bit, obviously, about Iran today, particularly about Iran, but we've also touched on China with the taking of Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig. Perhaps you could tell us what other countries do this and how.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for the opportunity to be here and share what I know. I've been working on hostage issues for around 2 decades now. From outside of government, we're working very closely with government, both in the UK and the United States. And over the course of those 20 years, I have seen state hostage-taking rise considerably. I would say that there has been an escalation over the past 10 years. I would also say that it's important to point out it's not just dual nationals that are being taken as well. So I've seen an escalation over the last 10 years. It's very difficult to put absolute numbers on this because there is no data set, as we heard from the former Foreign Secretary, Philip Hammond. Our own Foreign Office doesn't release data on the number of Britons who are being held overseas. To give you an insight, and then I'll come on to your question of breadth, to give you an insight, a paper published several months ago by Carla Firstman documented 62 foreigners held in Iran between 2010 and 2021. Those are just the publicly known ones, and we know that 2/3 of those are Europeans. So even if we just look at Iran, we're looking at a considerable number, and those are just the ones that we know. It is, as you said, Mr. Chairman, it is not just Iran. We also see China and Russia in particular active and becoming more aggressive in this stance, depending on which victim country you're talking about. Also of importance are North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba. You mentioned, it was mentioned earlier, the cases in India, the Chennai 6, Egypt, Saudi Arabia and Turkey. So this is a broader range of countries. And just one final thing I would say on the state of the problem and the extent of the problem is that it's becoming more and more obvious to me that state hostage-taking is the thin end of the wedge here. If we look at the way that those countries are behaving internationally writ large, what they're doing in the space of hostage-taking mirrors what they're doing in other areas. The most obvious example of that right now, of course, is Russia's invasion into Ukraine. It's a set of countries that are sort of ignoring the international rules. They're throwing the precedent out the window and becoming increasingly aggressive. And I worry about escalation in this space, and I would just point to the plight of a Swedish national who has had the death penalty threatened against him just within the last couple of weeks.
Where?
In Iran.
I'm so sorry, I couldn't hear.
In Iran.
In Iran, thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. Jenkins, can I ask, from your perspective, who are the worst offenders? Where are you seeing this hostage-taking being used in a particularly pernicious way?
Well, I would certainly agree with the previous speaker. I mean, we see the serial defenders. That is, if we look at this as a global phenomenon, there are a number of countries that account for a large share of the total detentions. Iran would lead the list. Turkey certainly would be on it since 2016 as a result of the post-coup crackdown. North Korea would be on the list. Egypt, Venezuela, China, Syria, and Russia. Although I should emphasize here that Iran and North Korea alone, at least in terms of those, the list of detainees that we know about, Iran and North Korea alone account for more than half. What is fascinating is not only is this something that appeared to have increased in the last 10 or 12 years, but if we go back to May 2011, the arrest of Kamal Khashoggi, there has always been at least one British national detained by Iran, and since August 2017, never less than 3 until the most recent release of the 2 hostages. This appears to be a kind of a bank account that as a result of continued detentions, lengthy detentions, and partial releases, one never gets to 0. There is always a remaining hostage. So that indicates to me, at least, this is a form of statecraft. That this is a form of coercive diplomacy. The previous speaker also mentioned the issue of that these are countries that operate outside of the norms, and that is so. These are countries that are already facing sanctions for their activities in other domains, which makes diplomacy in terms of obtaining the release of these detainees especially difficult, because there is not a lot of headroom for applying pressure or escalating pressure on them. They are already outside the norms, already under pressure, and continue to use this as a form of coercive diplomacy.
Thank you.
Can I just double check with both of the speakers, just on a definition of state hostage taking? Because there clearly is a potential difference, or an overlap at least, with corruption, abuse of legal proceedings, abuse of power, and people taking hostages for financial reasons, as opposed to a pure state hostage taking, which could well have been the case, and was probably the case in Nazanin's instance, for example. So is there a definition of state hostage taking, or does anyone want to attempt one here? Related to that, you've mentioned at least a dozen states. Are we talking about roughly a dozen states or roughly 20 states who are practicing this? And when did state hostage taking become a tool of, I don't know, hybrid war, statecraft, however you want to define it? Rachel, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can remember all of those questions
Okay.
off the top of my head. So help me as we go along, would you?
Definition, numbers, and when did it become a state tool?
Okay, definition, numbers, and when. Okay, great. So I am not a legal scholar. I'm just a simple soul, and so I will defer to, perhaps Brian can help on the sort of the legal definition. I would go back to sort of agreements that we have internationally on the Convention of Hostage Taking, which talks about holding somebody, number 1, against their will, number 2, and number 3, seeking some kind of trade concession from a third party. So that's why I would take these cases as being hostage taking, rather than I would take issue with the language that we use around arbitrary detention and so on. That's a longer conversation I'm very happy to weigh in on. So that's the reason that I would use that particular terminology on that, and I apologise, I may not get to the nub of your question because it would go outside of my expertise. I think we are talking around somewhere between a dozen to 20 countries that are engaged in this, so that would be a simple yes. Occasionally countries pop up and go down, and we see that in other types of hostage taking as well, because we're talking about small numbers, so you've only got to take a few to suddenly jump up be present and jump up the league table. And when as I said when I opened, 20 years ago, was I seeing any of this? I don't know whether I was particularly, which doesn't mean there wasn't any prior to that. That's the start of my professional engagement. It's really been within the last decade or so that these cases started popping onto my caseload when I was running both Hostage International and Hostage US. And as I say, over that time period, Brian may have a longer time perspective than I do, so I would defer to him on whether we could look further back than that time period.
Thank you. Just Brian, I mean, I'm aware of your Vietnam past. Do you think what the Vietnamese state was doing in the 1970s accounted to state hostage taking? How many people were doing it back then? When did it become more common?
Well, I mean, if we really go back in time, holding hostages, states holding hostages to either coerce another state or to ensure the good behavior of another state that was perhaps a protectorate or something like that, goes back into antiquity. I mean, one can find examples in Persian statecraft of this. They've been doing it for a long time. They're very, very good at it. With regard to the number of countries, I would say about a dozen. I think really 10 to 12 is going to get us into close to 90% of the activity, and then we're looking at one-offs here and there. With regard to definition, there isn't a precise legal definition. The working group on arbitrary detention at the United Nations looks at those who have been deprived of their liberty, either arbitrarily, that is, they have not been beneficiaries of an open judicial system, access to lawyers, public trials, things of this sort, but are held incommunicado, tried in secret, or they are held for violation of of basic human rights, that is, an expression of religion or free speech. That's the UN working group definition. Governments, national governments, take a different view of this. For example, in the United States, will not really describe a case as arbitrary detention simply because someone has been arrested for something that in the United States would not be a crime, but is a crime in that country. In other words, we're very cautious about this. In many cases, persons will be arrested on ordinary criminal charges, but the criminal charges have nothing to do with the purpose of the arrest or as it turns into really coercive diplomacy. So somebody may be arrested on an espionage charge, on a subversion charge, or even on an ordinary criminal charge, violation of a visa regulation or something like that. And then over time, it becomes apparent that this person is not being held for that particular crime, but that there is another agenda.
And Brian, just on that point, is there any evidence that you've come across of states using state hostage taking as part of an integrated approach to foreign policy, or does it tend to be a bit of a standalone, separate event?
It is, again, I think a handful of states are using this as a routine form of policy. It's a form of, I mean, we can say it is war by other means. It's coercive diplomacy, and it certainly is routinized. However, where it becomes complex is that in a number of places, including Iran, there is not a single-minded authority on this. That is, someone may be taken into custody by the Revolutionary Guard that has its own agenda. And our governments tend to deal with foreign ministries, the Foreign Office, and they may be the official representative of that country, but they don't hold the keys. They are not the ones making the calls. And so in many cases, there will be tensions and internal politics that are being sorted out in the process of an outside government attempting to obtain a release of one of its nationals.
Thank you. And Rachel, sorry, I'm going to come to the question. Apologies. Whereas the UK government and the FCO in particular got their consular response to hostage-taking right, and where do you think there's been room for improvement about the way they've conducted themselves? And again, please feel free to answer in comparison with other European states or the US or Canada.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of where the Foreign Office has got things right, I would point very specifically to the Special Cases Unit, which is the unit within the Consular Division that deals with. We had an intense debate in the last session about what constitutes special cases, but there is indeed a unit within the Consular Division called the Special Cases Unit, which deals with these kind of cases, plus hostage cases and other especially complex consular cases. I had the privilege of working alongside that unit when I was based here in the UK and running Hostage International. I don't speak on behalf of that organisation, but I can say that the consular care and attention that unit was able to give to families and in some cases the most horrific of details, and families getting dreadful news and dreadful predictions, was quite extraordinary. It's a specialised unit. It's a unit of people who have been specially trained to deal with individuals under crisis. They are, of course, subject to their political masters, and in many instances find themselves the messengers of unwelcome and difficult messages. But I would really point to that. The other sort of thing I would point to, which is outside the permit, but the remit of the Foreign Office, is the Guardianship Act, which went through the House a number of years ago, which was particularly helpful for both hostage cases and state hostage cases, such that when a member of your family is overseas, unable to sign things, approve things, etc., the presence of that act now allows families to get on with their business of running the family, running the home, etc., and can't underestimate just how important that is, and certainly I know that the Foreign Office fed into that somewhat. So my exposure has been mostly on the consular side of things, and I could really point to those as being positives. The areas for improvement, shall we say? I think there's an issue. I think there's an issue about political leadership in relation to these cases, which is not to point the finger at any particular foreign secretary or minister of state, but is to say that we have decision making happening amongst. If you only got to take Nazanin's case, was it 5 foreign secretaries over 6 years or whatever it was? A new person coming into post, like a revolving door. Jeremy Hunt said to you last week, it took me a few months to realise that X. It took me another few months to realise that Y. You have the key decision makers who are having to figure this out as they go along, and that churn in decision making, that the lack of centralised expertise on the business of getting hostages out, which is not the business of the Special Cases Unit. That's there as family support and liaison. But the churn and the lack of consistency in that bit of the Foreign Office it's obvious it has slowed things down for real families waiting to get their loved ones home. I would really, and this is something that the McGregor review touched on as well, which is the use of kind of double speak and innuendo in relation to state hostage taking. The McGregor review said in no uncertain terms, stop telling families we're doing everything we can, quote unquote. Be specific. Bring families into the strategy, have a strategy. Families need consistent and honest communication. They need information about what's happening. They need data about how these cases have been handled previously and how and why that might be relevant to their loved ones' cases. They need signposting to practical advice from organisations like Hostage International. And they do need careful advice on media to go public or not to go public.
Sorry, when was just a factual question, when was the Special Units case set up?
That is good question. I started running Hostage International in 2007 and it wasn't in place.
If you'd like to write to us, you're very welcome to.
I will, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Maybe 10 years ago, 12 years ago.
Thank you, Chair. Can I go back to your opening remarks where you talked about hostage taking being on the rise? Could you get into this under the weeds of what the patterns you're noticing are in terms of why is it on the rise, what's happening, how is it presenting itself?
So in terms of why it's on the rise, I mean, clearly there are different dynamics in each of the countries that we're talking about, and I do not feel I can speak to that. So I'll be very clear about where my expertise ends and where it starts. But I do think that we have seen over the last 10 years a growing, should I say, confidence on the part of certain countries to colour outside of the lines in international and diplomatic terms, a growing confidence on the part of those countries to become more and more audacious in what they're prepared to do. And as I said when I opened, it's not just in the realm of hostage taking, it's in all sorts of other areas of international relations as well. So I would say that getting into the trends of individual countries, I think you would be best served by experts in those particular countries. But I definitely see a growing confidence across a certain range of countries who are willing to who are basically writing their own rules these days. Sorry, go on.
You mentioned briefly earlier what's currently going on in Ukraine and what Russia's doing in Ukraine, and I wondered if you could speak to that briefly, because I mean, is it hostage taking, for example, when pre the February invasion, when Russia has obviously occupied eastern Ukraine since 2014, that whole issue of passportization in eastern Ukraine, is that hostage taking, for example, or is it not, in your view?
Yeah, that would be outside of my expertise. Okay. One thing that I would mention in relation to Russia is, of course, that Russia took an American hostage just right before, who has now been classified by Secretary Blinken as being arbitrarily detained, to use their parlance, as I would call it, a hostage.
And what we've also got happening right now in Ukraine are huge numbers of civilians, many of them children, being illegally bussed out of the country off to various different parts of Russia. Is that hostage taking in your view? I'm
going to be very clear about what my expertise is and isn't, and I focus on question that's being taken.
What do you think it is? What law do you think is? I mean, it's a breach of presumably international law to just take full orphanages, ship them out the country, and repatriate them elsewhere. Is that a form of hostage taking in your view?
It's. I would hope that at the right time, the law of war is and war crimes comes into account. Okay. So I apologise that I can't answer that.
Please don't apologise. Mr. Briggs, do you have any views on what's happening right now? I do want to come back to the McGregor review with you as well.
Are you speaking
Mr.
to me?
Jenkins, sorry, I've got the chair.
I'm sorry. All right. Now, look, again, it's necessary to disaggregate some of these issues, and you're pointing out some of the reasons why. The issue of taking people illegally and holding them hostage during war, or removing them and detaining them. There are existing rules of war, a law of war, and international humanitarian law that address these specific topics. But there are many different dimensions. I mean, we went through in the United States the issue of our embassy being taken over in Tehran, and the occupants of the embassy being held for more than a year, which was clearly a case of coercive diplomacy. We're looking at individual arrests. So there are a vast variety of cases. It's I know we have seen this increase in the last decade or so, but the working group at the UN was created in the 1990s. They've been at this for a long time. This is something that we've been seeing build up over a period of time on this. There is, however, I think, and I'm not an international lawyer, but there is a bit of a lack of international law to deal more specifically what we are talking about in terms of wrongful detentions or arbitrary detentions, the terms that are used frequently on this. That probably can use some work. And in fact, Canada is initiating an international effort to gain more international support for an effort to somehow make a statement against this. By the way, you'll hear me constantly using the word detainees as opposed to hostages, and that is deliberate. Our policies in the United States, and in fact the major organizational and procedural review that we undertook of this in 2014, 2015, was driven by hostages held by terrorists, by non-government organizations. Over a period of time since then, it has expanded that same office, our special presidential envoy for hostage affairs, is also dealing with arbitrary detentions. But the reason in making the distinction is that we have very clear policies with regard to concessions that will, to obtain the release of hostages held by terrorists. The United States government will not pay ransom, will not make concessions. In the case of arbitrary detentions, this falls into the area of diplomacy, and in fact, in diplomacy, and there are all sorts of, in a sense, ultimate arrangements that are made. In fact, in the arbitrary detentions, if we look at the outcomes when people are released, there is almost always a quid pro quo. And we don't want to discourage that kind of agile or creative diplomacy by contaminating it, in a sense, with policies that are put in place to deal with terrorist events. And so we make that distinction I think, in our approach and our language.
Can I ask you about, a while back the committee had an inquiry on UK membership of various multilateral bodies, and one of those we looked at was Interpol, and we took some evidence on how Interpol was being abused by some countries. You can think of some high-profile cases, I'm sure, off the top of your head right now. I wondered if you had any thoughts on how a body like Interpol is being used by states to detain people wrongfully and curtail their freedom of passage and all the rest of it. To what extent do you think Interpol is being abused? That's always that's a chronic problem in terms of, particularly with
notices that are put out that this individual traveling in a country, that there's a warrant out for their arrest and they must be detained and turned back to the country. This is really a push toward extraterritoriality, and it is used for harassment purposes, for restricting the activities. In some cases of foreign nationals, and in other cases of a country's own nationals when they are abroad on this. So it's a chronic problem that Interpol has and has to deal with. By the way, I don't see Interpol as playing a particular role in the diplomacy to obtain the release of hostages. So they have, in a sense, they're victims of abuse. They are not, in my view, the appropriate actors in the very complex negotiations to bring about releases.
Could I come back on something, if I may, which came up earlier and which I referred to, which is around the language that we use about these cases. And I think Brian and I are coming from the same place, but I would depart from him in terms of the importance of using the term hostage taking. I was really struck in the evidence that was given last week by Alistair Burt and Jeremy Hunt, who, and I will paraphrase them dreadfully now, but what came across to me was both of them saying, one by one, I used the diplomatic tools I have in my diplomatic toolbox, and one after the other, every single one of those tools failed. And it strikes me that really this kind of isn't a diplomatic problem. Diplomacy is certainly one of the tools that you want to have, but it's, at its heart, this isn't a diplomatic problem. We also heard last week about how, and again this afternoon with Philip Hammond, about how the Foreign Office is hampered in how it can deal with these cases. If you take Iran as an example, the Foreign Office has relationships with the Foreign Ministry in Iran. It does not have a relationship with the people who are really doing the hostage taking. So for me, for various reasons, calling it hostage taking is really important, because we need to acknowledge that this is not something that I don't think should be led and owned exclusively by diplomats. They should, of course, be involved. The former Foreign Secretary just described to us that he spent his time as a Foreign Secretary thinking he was leading on a decision, and it wasn't until he got the job of Chancellor that he realised it hadn't been his decision. That this is an all-of-government problem. It's incredibly complicated, and we need something at the heart of government which can bring together all of those different strands. And to go back to the McGregor review, that was absolutely one of the recommendations. I think she referred to it as the London Task Force. And the closest example I think we have of that is something which Brian mentioned, which is the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, which has become sort of de facto the focus for these kind of cases in an American context. And because this is an ambassadorial appointment, somebody who can who reports directly to the president, is able to get really difficult political decisions made, which are at the heart of solving these problems. You know, you rely on, whether it's a foreign secretary, a prime minister, or another minister of high office, being willing to make decisions that are very big, very complicated, and potentially hold risks for them personally and for the government as a whole. So that it's a model that I think we should absolutely go back to the McGregor review. We should look at the way in which the as we call SPIHA in the US centralises decision making, centralises expertise, is able to draw exactly the trends. You know, how do we, what's happening, what's working? Is there something that we're doing to get folks home from China that we could apply to Iran and vice versa? How do we aggregate all of this information? And so it's absolutely a model that we should look at, but I just really want to underline the central point, which is we have to see this as hostage taking because there's a deal to be done. Nobody comes home without a deal. If Iran is not willing to release a breastfeeding mother of a 22-month-old baby on humanitarian grounds, nobody's coming home on humanitarian grounds. This is about doing a deal. It's about trading, and therefore the language of hostage taking is important, because otherwise we're using a hammer. It's a nail, you know, whatever that sort of. No,
I think your point is powerfully made, and I want to continue along the line of the McGregor review. You obviously talked about some of the things that we should be doing, but could you talk more broadly about the progress that you think has or hasn't been made on some of the recommendations? Did the review itself go far enough in your view? And in terms of support for families, support for detainees and their families, you know, where do you think we need to go in that regard?
Yeah, absolutely. I thought the review was great. I kind of agreed, I think, from memory with every word of it. There were 5 things that really stood out from the review as being very important. Number 1, a centralised London task force. Number 2, proactive family engagement. Number 3, access to ministers and ambassadors for families and consistency around that access. Clear and consistent data on what works. Going back through the files and analysing what did we do and what didn't we do. And more resources for this area. And none of that has happened. I'm at a loss as to why none of that has happened. When the former Foreign Secretary spoke this afternoon, it was clear that going back to the notes, there was no central repository where he was able to trace who, what, where, when and how on one particular case, let alone trends across time. None of that has happened, and I think that's a great shame.
I invite you to speculate as to why. I know you say you're at a loss, but you can say no, but I invite you to do so.
Okay. Why is that not happening? It will involve, and I am speculating, it will involve, I think, considerable change. I think it will involve political capital from the top of the office. It would involve a way in solving these cases which took them away from political desks and centralised them in the creation of a new unit that simply doesn't exist right now. So, I've worked for many years alongside the Foreign Office, and it's great in all sorts of ways, but there is a speed which I think would be required to make this happen, which and I guess change at the top doesn't help.
And in terms of support, essential support for families, for detainees, what do you think has to change there specifically?
I would really point to 5 things. Communications, and that's a kind of a cultural thing. It's moving away from a culture where I believe this was said in the McGregor report, but it was something similar. Moving away from families being handled and managed to families being partners. And that is a shift that I saw during my 5 years in the US, that the US government did manage to bring about that cultural change. So it is possible. And that relationship being grounded on honesty. The number of times I've worked with families who are frustrated because the politicians at the Foreign Office won't admit the limits of their powers, won't admit, in this particular case, there's nothing more we can do, or we just don't have the leverage right now. Perhaps you should think about an alternative solution. Information is absolutely key. We've been round and round sort of the issue of declassifying information for families. I don't know the current status of that because I haven't been working with the Foreign Office on this for a number of years, but I would hazard a guess that that lags still. Practical help, I've mentioned some of that already, and then really, really honest advice for families about going to the media or not going to the media, and that is a whole different area, and I'd very happily launch into where my views have shifted on that over time.
Thanks, Chair.
Just to follow up what Rachel was saying, Brian, can you just talk about the evolution of the American model and how the various components have come together? And when Rachel was talking about, what was the title? Was it the Special
Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs?
Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs. Do you think, for example, Brian, that Britain would gain from somebody similar to be the focal point for state hostage taking? Thank you.
And thank you. I want to be careful here and not really be so arrogant as to suggest that the United Kingdom should follow the US model on this. So instead of saying that the UK should have the equivalent of a SPIHA or some of the mechanisms that we have created, I think let me talk about the thinking that was behind those, and Rachel has already outlined some of that. Number one, she is absolutely correct. This is a whole of government enterprise. And whether we're dealing with terrorist hostage taking or arbitrary detention, it is really necessary to bring together the assets that the government may have. In the case of terrorist kidnapping abroad, I mean, that is our intelligence sources, diplomatic sources to engage the assistance of other nations, military resources, again, a whole of government. We found that one of our difficulties is that while the entire government was engaged in these, they weren't necessarily all talking to one another. I mean, the U.S. government is this gigantic, complex thing. And so part of the solution also, and this was to deal with a terrorist hostage taking, was the creation of something called the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell, which brought together the FBI, the State Department, the intelligence community, the defense people, so that we wouldn't have, on the one hand, somebody doing something diplomatically, while on the other hand, the Defense Department is doing something else, and someone else is doing yet a third thing, that we could bring them together. And for dealing with arbitrary detentions, the same concept applies, that we needed someone to be able to coordinate these pieces of government. Now, in the U.S. government, in order to do that, Rachel is correct, the post of Speha carries ambassadorial rank. He is an ambassador that reports directly, in a sense, to the White House, and that gives him some bureaucratic muscle. He is not the ultimate decision maker in these cases. He's not a czar in that sense, but he does ensure that all of these complexities, political, diplomatic, intelligence, in some of these cases involving treasury issues and so on, are all brought together in a whole government effort. And so that is a principle which I think stands. How do you bring it together and coordinate? Rachel mentioned another factor which is key, and that is the lack of institutional memory. Consular officers, like investigators, tend to deal with case-by-case basis. You deal with a case, closed case, next case. Where do we bring together the knowledge, the know-how, the experience that was gained in each case, so that if we are to have, in a sense, creative, agile diplomacy that can not have to start over again, scratching its head about how do we do this, we have some experience. So it's a repository for institutional learning, and experience was another factor. Rachel also mentioned, and this was in the McGregor report, the issue of the very difficult issue of dealing with the families. When I was involved over the years in numerous cases as an advisor in negotiations to attempt to obtain the release of hostages held by terrorists, I can tell you that I spend something like 5% of my time dealing with issues of the actual kidnapping, and 95% of my time dealing with the families. That is a critical, that's a critical issue, keeping them on board, not having them go off in a different direction that may be counterproductive. How do we engage them? How do we utilize them? How do we keep them from doing understandingly, but perhaps unwittingly, do things that simply complicate the negotiations?
And Brian, just on that point, when you're talking about the families, but also more generally, how much of a distinction do you make between hostages that are held by a state and hostages that are held by a non-state actor, be it a Colombian drug cartel that's holding something for somebody for a quasi-political reason, and ISIS, as opposed to, for example, China or Iran? Or are they so different because of the power structures between the dissimilarities between a Colombian drug cartel and the Chinese state that you find it difficult to make similarities?
Well, each one of these cases is unique, even within the two domains of arbitrary detentions and terrorist hostage taking. There was, for example, you mentioned Colombia. I mean, such a high volume of kidnappings in Colombia some years back that one looking at this could really come up with all right, this is this group, they have them, this is their modus operandi, this is the market price for a hostage, this is the amount of ransom that it's going to take, roughly in this neighborhood, to get these individuals back. So there it was somewhat easier. Ransom was a more straightforward thing. It was complex. It was complex because policy, the official policy of the U.S. government, basically took the position that they're not going to be involved in this. That is, if we get into the business with negotiations with terrorists, designated terrorist organizations, and the U.S. government is going to be an opponent of that, and it wouldn't actively interfere. I've never seen a case where the government actually tried to interfere. There was a stupid comment made by a U.S. official to the families of American hostages held by ISIS in Syria, that if they persisted in an attempt to arrange some sort of a private ransom arrangement, that they could be prosecuted under the material support provision of the Patriot Act for providing material assistance to a terrorist group. That was utter nonsense. The Department of Justice has never contemplated bringing into court the family of a hostage for their efforts to get them back.
Okay. But just summing up from both of you, effectively it's collective memory and learning, plus as much as integrated action across government as government can muster, are important lessons for dealing with hostages.
Yes, and dealing with families.
Fantastic, thank you.
Thank you very much. If I may, I'm going to close with two brief questions. Mr. Jenkins, you've largely covered this. I was just wondering if I could turn to Ms. Briggs and ask about coordination with like-minded countries. How do you think we could improve that coordination? Do you think it's possible?
I do, yes. I think it's harder in the case of bringing people home, and it's easier in the case of long-term strategies to end the crime. The Canadian Declaration is a great start. We have 60-plus countries that have signed up to it, but it has no teeth and it has no action right now. So it's a signatory. So more can be done to bring folks together. I'm noticing now more often that countries are willing to talk out when somebody else's national has been taken, and we need more of that. More coordinated action on things like sanctions, Magnitsky sanctions, etc., etc. They're most impactful when we do them together, we do them simultaneously, and we go big. And so I think there's absolutely more that we could do on the preventive side. As has been said, when you're getting people home, on the sort of the reactive side, that coordination is tricky. But actually, so many of these cases, there are more than, as somebody has said, this isn't a two-player sport. This is often a multiplayer sport. And I could point to a number of cases where it's not two governments negotiating. It's many. And the other thing that I think it's really important to have on your agenda is the role of non-state actors. I've seen, and this is something that the US is doing increasingly effectively, is working with those who are outside of government, because this is all of government, but it's all of society. So whether that is well-connected families, whether that's diasporas playing a role, whether that's private, incredibly well-connected individuals like David Bradley at The Atlantic, whether it's lawyers who are acting on behalf of and advocating creatively around the margins, there's quite a considerable amount that can be done by the private...
The Vatican has had a role in the past.
Absolutely. Richardson Centre in the US has done marvellous work in this space. So there's more that the British government could do to not just coordinate itself better, but provide formal mechanisms to allow for proper engagement with those who are outside of government as well.
Okay, well, thank you. That's very useful. May I just ask a brief technical question, which is about the diplomatic protection that was offered to Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe. Was that useful? Did it have an effect?
I mean, it was an interesting thing to do. As far as I'm aware, it hasn't been done previously. As an outsider, I'm not quite sure how much was done with it. So it's one of those things where I think we need to properly look at it and analyse what was done behind closed doors, what more could have been done. And it wasn't extended to any of the other families, as far as I understand.
Perhaps it's something I could invite others to write to us on, or if you have further considerations, maybe you'd like to as well, Ms Briggs. Before I close, can I just again pay tribute to Richard Radcliffe, who's been with us throughout this session. He's been an extraordinarily courageous voice, not just for his wife, but for many others who've been held in detention. And in that, I have to say, I pay personal, and I'm sure on behalf of the whole committee, enormous tribute. Richard, it's nice to see you. May I also add that this committee has in the past called out the hostage taking of people like Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, and if there are people that you feel that we should be aware of, names that we should know, either for Mr Jenkins and Ms Briggs, who are here before us today, but others who may be listening as I speak blankly into the ether, who may be aware of individuals that we should be aware of, would be very grateful to know and would be very happy to help where we can. On that note, I say thank you very much to our clerks, and order.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.